The restaurant had been closed to the public since 6 in the evening, and every window along the street was covered with dark paper so no one outside could see inside. Antonio Marchetti sat at the head of a long wooden table, his fingers resting flat against the surface, his eyes fixed on the man across from him. The room smelled of old wine and fresh tension. 6 men sat around that table, 3 on each side, and not one of them moved more than they had to. Nicholas Bardo leaned back in his chair like he owned the building. He was younger than Antonio by almost 10 years, and he wore that youth the way some men wear a loud tie, as if it were something to be noticed. His voice, when he spoke, carried the kind of confidence that only comes from never having lost anything important. "You brought your father to a business meeting," Nicholas said, tilting his head toward the corner of the room. "That's cute, real touching. Does he still remember how to use a fork, or do you cut his food for him now?" A few of Nicholas's men smiled, though carefully, watching Antonio's face for a reaction. In the corner of the room, seated slightly apart from the table, an old man in a gray wool coat sat with his hands folded in his lap. He had not said a single word since he walked in. His name was Vincent Marchetti, and to almost everyone in that room, he was simply Antonio's father, an old man who had outlived his usefulness and was kept around out of family duty rather than respect. Antonio did not answer right away. He had learned, over many years, that silence could be a weapon sharper than any words, and he intended to use it now. But Nicholas was not a patient man, and patience was exactly what tonight required. "Let's talk about the shipment," Antonio finally said, his voice even and controlled. "You were supposed to deliver 3 nights ago. My people waited at the dock until sunrise. Nobody showed up. Things changed," Nicholas said with a shrug. "Maybe you should have called first. Or maybe," he added, his eyes flicking again toward the corner, "your father could have told you that plans change. He seems like a man who's used to things falling apart around him." The comment landed heavier than Nicholas probably intended. One of Antonio's men, a broad-shouldered man named Peter, who had worked for the Marchetti family for almost 20 years, shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened. Antonio felt the same tightness in his own chest, but he kept his hands still on the table, refusing to give Nicholas the satisfaction of a reaction. "You're testing something tonight," Antonio said quietly. "I don't think you understand what you're testing." Nicholas laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed slightly in the closed room. "I understand plenty. I understand that the great Marchetti family isn't so great anymore. I understand that you've got an old man sitting in the corner who hasn't said a word all night because he's got nothing left to say. Times change, Antonio. Some families grow. Others just get old and quiet, waiting for someone younger to take what they can't hold on to anymore." The room went still in a different way now, the kind of stillness that comes right before something breaks. Antonio's hand moved, almost without his permission, toward the inside of his jacket. Peter's eyes darted to the door. Across the table, Nicholas's own men straightened slightly, sensing the shift in the air, ready for whatever might come next. And then, from the corner of the room, a chair scraped softly against the floor. Every head turned. Vincent Marchetti was standing. He had not moved this entire meeting, had barely seemed to breathe, and now he rose slowly, without hurry, the way a man rises when he has all the time in the world and no reason to rush toward anything. His gray coat hung loosely on a frame that had once, long ago, been much larger. His face was lined with age, but his eyes, when he finally lifted them to look at Nicholas Bardo, held something none of the younger men in that room had ever seen in him before. Nicholas's smile faltered, just slightly, though he tried to cover it. "Something to say, old man?" he asked, his voice not quite as steady as it had been a moment ago. Vincent did not answer immediately. He simply looked at Nicholas, studying his face the way someone studies an old photograph, searching for a resemblance they are not sure they want to find. The silence stretched long enough that even Antonio, who thought he knew his father completely, felt a strange unease creeping up his spine. He had never seen this look on his father's face before, not once, in 40 years. Peter, standing near the wall, noticed something else. He noticed that Vincent's hands, folded so calmly a moment ago, were now completely still at his sides, and that stillness felt different from the stillness of an old man who had nothing left to offer. It felt like the stillness of someone waiting, someone who had waited a very long time for a moment exactly like this one. Nicholas shifted in his chair, trying to reclaim the ground he had lost without quite understanding why he had lost it. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice edged with the beginning of something that might have been nerves, though he would never have admitted it. Vincent's gaze did not waver. He continued to look at Nicholas, at the shape of his jaw, the set of his eyes, as though searching for a name buried somewhere deep in memory. And then, at last, the old man opened his mouth. Before he could speak, one of Antonio's associates, a younger man named Daniel who had joined the family only 2 years earlier, made a small movement toward the door, perhaps sensing that whatever was about to happen, it was best not to be caught standing too close to it. Antonio noticed the movement out of the corner of his eye, but said nothing. His attention, like everyone else's in the room, was fixed entirely on his father. Nicholas's men exchanged uncertain glances. This was not how these meetings usually went. The old man was supposed to be furniture, a quiet presence in the corner, nothing more. He was not supposed to stand. He was certainly not supposed to speak. The tension in the room had shifted entirely now, moving away from Antonio and Nicholas, and settling instead on the old man in the gray coat, who stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on a young crime boss who had no idea, not yet, that the ground beneath him had just begun to shift in ways he could not have imagined when he walked into that room an hour earlier, so certain of his own power, so certain that nothing in this world could touch him. Vincent took one slow step forward. The sound of his shoe against the wooden floor seemed impossibly loud in the silence that had settled over the room like a held breath. Nicholas's confidence, so thick and so easy just minutes before, had thinned into something brittle. He glanced at his own men, as if searching for reassurance, but found none. They were watching the old man too, all of them, waiting to see what would happen next, none of them daring to guess what it might be. And in that frozen moment, with every eye in the room fixed on him, Vincent Marchetti finally spoke. "Bardo," Vincent said, and even that single word, spoken in a voice roughened by age but carrying an unmistakable weight, made Nicholas sit up straighter, as though the sound of his own family name in that old man's mouth had struck something deep inside him. "That is your name. Your grandfather carried the same name, and I remember his face better than I remember most faces I have seen in my life." Nicholas said nothing. His mouth had opened slightly, but no words came out. Vincent continued walking, slow and deliberate, until he stood at the edge of the table, close enough now that Nicholas had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. "You speak about old men who have nothing left to say," Vincent said. "You are right about one thing. I have said very little for many years. But you should not mistake silence for emptiness, boy. Some men are quiet because they have nothing to offer. Other men are quiet because they have already said everything that needed saying, a long time ago, in a place far from here, to people who are no longer alive to argue about it." The room remained utterly still. Even Antonio, who had spent his entire life believing he understood his father completely, found himself leaning forward slightly, caught in the same current of attention that held everyone else in that room. "I don't know what you're talking about, old man," Nicholas said, though the sharpness that had colored his voice earlier in the evening had drained away, replaced by something more careful, more uncertain. Vincent studied him a moment longer, and then he spoke a single word in Italian, low and clear, a word that seemed to carry far more meaning than its short length would suggest. It was not a word of greeting, nor a word of comfort. It landed in the room like something heavy dropped from a great height, and the effect on Nicholas Bardo was immediate and unmistakable. His face lost its color. His hands, which had been resting confidently on the table only moments before, curled slowly into loose fists, not from anger, but from something closer to recognition, the kind of recognition that arrives uninvited and unwelcome, dragging old memories up from wherever they had been buried. "Where did you hear that word?" Nicholas said, his voice barely above a whisper now, all the earlier bravado gone from it entirely. "I did not hear it," Vincent said. "I spoke it, many years ago, to a man who shared your blood, in a town you have probably never visited, though your family came from there before they came here. Your grandfather knew this word well. He knew what it meant when it was spoken, and he knew what it meant when it was broken." Nicholas's men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them, An older man near the back, who had clearly been with the Bardo family longer than most, looked suddenly pale, as though he too recognized something in what had just been said, some fragment of family history he had heard whispered about, but never fully understood. Antonio watched his father with an expression somewhere between confusion and awe. He had grown up believing Vincent Marchetti was exactly what he appeared to be, a quiet immigrant who had worked hard, kept his head down, and eventually stepped back from the family business entirely, leaving it to his son to build into something larger. He had never once imagined that his father carried history like this, history that could make a man like Nicholas Bardo, a man who feared almost nothing, go pale and silent in the space of a few seconds. "You don't know anything about my family," Nicholas said, trying to recover some of his earlier confidence, though it came out thinner than he intended, less a statement and more a question dressed up as one. "I know more than you would like," Vincent said simply. "I know why your grandfather left the town where he was born. I know why he came to this country instead of staying to face the people he owed a debt to, and I know that debt did not disappear simply because he crossed an ocean and changed his name to something easier for people here to pronounce." The silence that followed felt different from the silence before. It was not the silence of shock alone. It carried something else now, an awareness settling slowly across the room, moving from face to face like a current passing through still water. Peter, standing by the wall, glanced at Antonio, silently asking a question his boss could not yet answer. Daniel, near the door, had gone very still, his earlier instinct to leave replaced now by a stronger instinct to stay and see how this would end. Nicholas looked at his own men, searching their faces for some sign of what to do, some cue for how to respond to an old man who had just unraveled, in a handful of sentences, the careful image of strength and stability his family name was supposed to represent. None of them offered him anything. They were as lost in this moment as he was. "That was a long time ago," Nicholas said finally, though his voice had lost almost all of its earlier edge. "Whatever happened between you and my grandfather has nothing to do with tonight." "Perhaps not," Vincent said, "or perhaps it has everything to do with tonight. You walked into this room and spoke as though history began the day you were born, as though nothing before you matters, as though the people sitting quietly in the corners of rooms like this one have nothing to teach you. That is a mistake many young men make, and it is usually the last mistake they make before they learn better, one way or another." Nicholas swallowed. For the first time all evening, he looked genuinely uncertain, a young man who had walked into a room expecting an easy victory, and found instead something he could not fully understand, something rooted in a history he had only ever heard about in fragments, family stories told in hushed voices at gatherings, stories he had never taken seriously enough to ask about in full. Vincent turned his attention briefly to his son. Antonio met his father's eyes, and for a moment, something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that this conversation, whatever it truly meant, was far from finished. Then Vincent looked back at Nicholas. "I will not ask for an apology," Vincent said. "I do not need one. But I will tell you this. The shipment your family failed to deliver, the disrespect you offered my son at this table tonight, these things end now. Not because my son threatens you, though he could, and not because his men outnumber yours in this room, though they do. These things end because I am asking you to end them, and because somewhere in whatever your grandfather managed to tell your father before he died, there should be a memory of what it means when a man like me asks for something directly." Nicholas sat frozen for a long moment. Then, slowly, almost mechanically, he nodded. "The shipment will be delivered tomorrow," he said quietly. "In full. No excuses." "Good," Vincent said, and then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward his corner of the room, settling once more into his chair, as though nothing at all had happened, as though he had not just reshaped the entire balance of power in that room, with a single sentence spoken in a language most of the men present barely understood. The meeting ended quickly after that. Nicholas gathered his men and left with none of the swagger he had walked in with, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, more thoughtful, the look of a man who has just discovered that the world is larger and older than he had assumed, and that some debts, no matter how much time passes, do not simply disappear. When the last of Nicholas's men had left the restaurant, and the door had been locked behind them, Antonio remained standing near the head of the table, staring at his father with an expression he could not quite name. Peter and Daniel exchanged glances but said nothing, sensing that whatever was about to happen next was not meant for them to witness. "Everyone out," Antonio said quietly, and his men obeyed without question, filing out through the back entrance until only father and son remained in the empty restaurant, the smell of old wine still hanging faintly in the air, the dark paper still covering the windows, sealing them both inside a silence that felt entirely different now than it had an hour before. Antonio pulled out a chair and sat down slowly across from his father. 40 years, he said. 40 years I have known you, and you have never once told me any of this. Vincent looked at his son for a long moment before he spoke. There are things a man carries so that his children do not have to carry them, he said. I hoped you would never need to know what I know. Tonight, I did not have a choice. Who was he? Antonio asked. Nicholas's grandfather. What happened between you? Vincent was quiet for a long time, long enough that Antonio began to wonder if his father would answer at all. Outside, somewhere down the street, a car passed slowly, its headlights briefly sweeping across the paper-covered windows before disappearing again into the night. It is not a short story, Vincent finally said, and it is not one I have told anyone in more than 30 years, but you are right that you deserve to hear it now, especially since it has already found its way into a room you brought me into. He paused, folding his hands together on the table exactly as he had folded them earlier in his chair, the same posture of a man settling in for something that would take time to say properly. It begins in a small town, far from here, in a place you have never seen, during a time when the world worked very differently than it does now. Antonio leaned back slightly in his chair, understanding without being told that this would not be a brief conversation, that whatever his father was about to reveal had been buried carefully and deliberately for decades, and that tonight, for reasons neither of them could fully control, that burial had finally come undone. They left the restaurant separately, as they always did after a meeting, taking different cars along different streets before meeting again at Vincent's house on the quiet edge of town, a modest brick building with a small garden in front that Vincent had tended himself for as long as Antonio could remember. The house had always felt like an unremarkable place, a retired man's home, filled with old photographs and the smell of coffee brewing on a stovetop that had not been replaced in 20 years. Tonight, walking through the front door, Antonio found himself looking at the walls, the furniture, even the old clock above the fireplace, as though seeing them for the first time, wondering what other secrets might be hiding in plain sight throughout a house he had visited 1,000 times before. Vincent moved to the kitchen without a word, filling a small pot with water and setting it on the stove. Antonio followed, standing in the doorway, watching his father with new eyes. You don't have to make coffee, Antonio said. You have to talk to me. I am making coffee, Vincent replied evenly, because talking about this properly requires more than a few rushed minutes in an empty restaurant. Sit down. Be patient. You have waited 40 years without knowing this story. You can wait 10 more minutes while I make coffee. Antonio sat, though patience did not come easily to him tonight. He glanced toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms, half expecting his mother to appear, though he knew she had passed nearly a decade earlier, and the house had been quieter ever since, holding on to her absence the way old houses often do. In small details nobody bothered to change. While the water heated, Vincent spoke without turning around. Your sister called me yesterday, he said. She is worried about you again. She thinks this life will end badly for you, the way it ended for men she read about in the newspapers when she was young. Angela worries about everything, Antonio said. She always has. She is not wrong to worry, Vincent said, still facing the stove. Every man in this business eventually faces a night like tonight, a moment when everything could have gone very differently. Tonight, it did not go differently, because I was there, and because I chose to speak. But you should understand something, Antonio. I will not always be there. I will not always be able to speak the right word at the right moment to stop something from happening. The kettle began to whistle softly, and Vincent poured the water carefully over grounds in 2 small cups, carrying them to the table where Antonio sat waiting. He set one cup in front of his son and settled into the chair across from him with the other, wrapping both hands around it as though drawing warmth from the porcelain. though the kitchen was not particularly cold. "Tell me about the town," Antonio said. "Tell me about Nicholas's grandfather." Vincent took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "His name was Enzo Bardo," he said. "We were young men together, younger than you are now, in a town called Valle Cresta, in the hills not far from the coast. It was not a large town. Everyone knew everyone else's business, whether they wanted to or not. Enzo and I grew up 2 streets apart. We were friends before we were anything else, before the world around us decided what kind of men we would become." Antonio listened without interrupting, sensing that his father needed to tell this story at his own pace, in his own order, and that any question asked too early might close the door on things Vincent had not yet decided how to say. "There was a group of men who controlled much of what happened in that region," Vincent continued. "Not the kind of organization your generation would recognize easily, though it shared some of the same bones: old families, old rules, old debts, passed down like inheritance. Enzo and I were both drawn into that world when we were still boys, really, though we thought ourselves men at the time. We thought we understood everything about how the world worked. We understood almost nothing." He paused, staring down into his coffee, as though searching for the rest of the story somewhere in its dark surface. "For a time, Enzo and I were close, closer than brothers in some ways. We protected each other. We shared everything we had, which was not much in those days. But the world we were part of did not reward loyalty the way it should have. It rewarded ambition, and ambition has a way of turning friends into rivals when the stakes become high enough." "What happened between you?" Antonio asked again, more gently this time. "There was a matter of trust," Vincent said. "A responsibility given to both of us by the men above us, something that required absolute discretion, absolute loyalty. Enzo was given a piece of that responsibility that I was not given. I do not say this with bitterness. It was simply how things were divided at the time. But Enzo, for reasons I did not understand then and only partly understand now, made a choice that put many people in danger, including people I cared about deeply. He acted out of fear, I believe, though at the time I only understood it as betrayal." Antonio's coffee sat untouched in front of him, cooling slowly as he listened, fully absorbed now in a story he had never once suspected existed behind his father's quiet, unremarkable life. "The men above us discovered what Enzo had done," Vincent continued. "And in that world, at that time, such a discovery carried serious consequences. I was asked to be the one who confronted him, because of our closeness, because they believed I would be the only one Enzo would listen to without resistance. I agreed, though it was one of the hardest things I have ever done in my life. And the word," Antonio said quietly, "the word you said to Nicholas tonight." Vincent nodded slowly. "That word was spoken to Enzo on the night I confronted him," he said. "It is a word from an old tradition, one that carries very specific meaning among certain families from that region, families whose roots go back generations before either of us were born. When spoken in a particular context, it means that a debt has been recognized, that consequences have been acknowledged, and that the person who owes the debt understands exactly what is expected of them going forward. It is not a word spoken lightly, and it is not a word easily forgotten by anyone who has heard it spoken in earnest." Antonio finally lifted his cup and took a slow sip, buying himself a moment to absorb everything his father had said. "What did Enzo do?" he asked, "after you spoke to him?" "He left," Vincent said simply. "Within a month, he had gathered what remained of his family and left for America, hoping, I believe, that an ocean between himself and his past might be enough to erase the debt he owed. In some ways, he was right. Nobody pursued him across that ocean. The men above us had other concerns by then, other matters that demanded their attention. Enzo built a new life here, and eventually, I followed, though for very different reasons, reasons that had more to do with wanting to leave that entire world behind me than with following Enzo specifically." "Did you ever see him again?" Antonio asked. "Here, in this country." "Once," Vincent said. "Many years ago, before you were born. We spoke briefly. He asked me not to reveal what had happened between us to anyone, and I agreed, partly out of the friendship we once shared, and partly because I had no interest in dragging old history into a new life I was trying to build for myself and for your mother." I assumed the matter would remain buried forever, a piece of the past neither of us would ever need to speak of again. But tonight, it wasn't buried anymore, Antonio said. No, Vincent agreed. Tonight, his grandson walked into a room and mocked an old man he assumed had nothing left to offer, not understanding that the debt his own family carried had never truly been settled, only postponed. Some debts do not disappear simply because enough years pass. They wait, quietly, until circumstances bring them back into the light. Antonio sat back in his chair, turning the story over in his mind, trying to reconcile the image of his father as a quiet, retired man who had spent the last several decades tending a small garden and drinking coffee in this same kitchen, with the image of a young man in a distant town who had once been trusted with something serious enough to shape the entire course of another family's future. Does Nicholas know any of this? Antonio asked. The real story, not just the word. I doubt it, Vincent said. From his reaction tonight, I suspect he has heard only fragments, family stories told without full context, the kind of half-remembered history that gets passed down and distorted with each retelling. He recognized the word, or at least sensed its weight, but I do not believe he understood exactly why it carried that weight until tonight. He will ask his own family about it now, Antonio said. He will want answers. Yes, Vincent said, and that is where the danger lies, Antonio. Not in what happened between Enzo and me all those years ago, but in how Nicholas's family chooses to respond to being reminded of it. Old debts, once brought back into the light, do not always stay quiet again. Some men, when reminded of an old shame, choose to make peace with it. Others choose to lash out, hoping to bury the shame more deeply by silencing whoever brought it to the surface. A heavy silence settled over the kitchen. Antonio finally understood the full weight of what his father had done that evening. It was not simply a clever intervention that had saved a tense meeting from turning into something worse. It was the reopening of a wound that had been closed for decades, a wound that belonged to two families whose histories were now, once again, tangled together in ways neither Antonio nor Nicholas could fully control. What do we do now? Antonio asked quietly. Vincent finished the last of his coffee before answering. We wait, he said. We watch how the Bardo family responds. If Nicholas's father, or whoever leads that family now, chooses wisdom over pride, this matter can end quietly, the way it should have ended 30 years ago. If they choose otherwise, then we will need to be ready for whatever comes next. Antonio nodded slowly, though his mind was already racing ahead, considering the men he would need to speak with, the precautions he would need to take, the quiet preparations that would need to happen without alarming the rest of the family or drawing unnecessary attention. He thought of Peter, loyal and steady, and of Daniel, still young but sharp enough to be useful in the coming days. He thought of his sister Angela, and how she would react if she learned even a fraction of what had happened tonight. And he thought, most of all, of his father, sitting quietly across the table, an old man who had just revealed himself to be far more than anyone in that family had ever given him credit for. Why did you never tell me any of this before tonight? Antonio finally asked, the question that had been sitting beneath everything else since the moment his father had risen from his chair in that restaurant. Vincent considered the question carefully before answering. Because I hoped you would never need this story, he said. I hoped you would build a life where old debts from a town on the other side of the world would never matter, where the mistakes and burdens of my youth would stay buried in my youth, far away from yours. I was wrong to hope for that, perhaps. The world has a way of connecting things we would rather keep separate, but I do not regret trying to protect you from it for as long as I could. Antonio reached across the table and placed his hand briefly over his father's, an unfamiliar gesture between the two of them, neither given easily to physical displays of affection. I am glad you were there tonight, he said quietly. I do not think I fully understood, until this moment, how much I still have to learn from you. Vincent allowed himself something close to a smile, faint and brief, but genuine. There is more to tell, he said. If you are ready to hear the rest of it, the full story, from the beginning, exactly as it happened in Vallecresta, all those years ago. Antonio nodded, settling back into his chair, his coffee finally forgotten entirely, his full attention now fixed on his father, ready to hear a story that had waited decades to be told. Vallecresta sat in the hills above a stretch of coastline where the summers were long and dry, and the winters brought cold winds down from the mountains that made the old stone houses creak and settle through the night. Vincent had been 19 years old when the story truly began, and Enzo Bardo had been 20, the two of them close enough in age and temperament that people in the town often mistook them for cousins rather than simply friends who had grown up 2 streets apart. In those years, much of the town's daily life moved according to rules set by a group of older men who controlled the flow of goods, favors, and information throughout the region. It was not something spoken about openly, but everyone understood the shape of it, the way children understand the shape of a mountain looming over their town, without ever needing an explanation for why it is there. Vincent's own father had worked in service to this group in a minor capacity, arranging transport for goods moving between the coast and the inland towns, and it was through this connection that Vincent, still a young man with more ambition than sense, was drawn into more serious responsibilities. Enzo had been drawn in through a similar path, his own family carrying old ties to the group that stretched back 2 generations. The 2 young men were given tasks together at first, small errands that tested their reliability, their discretion, their willingness to keep quiet about things that did not concern them. They passed every test easily, and within 2 years, they had earned a level of trust that most men in that world did not achieve until they were much older. It was during the 3rd year of this trust that the older men, led by a careful and exacting figure named Salvatore Contadino, decided to hand Vincent and Enzo a responsibility unlike anything they had handled before. A shipment of considerable value was to move through the region, passing through 3 separate towns before reaching its final destination near the coast, and the entire operation depended on absolute secrecy. Only a handful of people were to know the full route, the timing, and the method by which the shipment would travel. Vincent and Enzo were among that handful, chosen specifically because of the trust they had earned, and because Contadino believed that 2 young men, working together and watching each other, would be less likely to make careless mistakes than a single man working alone. For the first 2 weeks, everything proceeded exactly as planned. Vincent handled the arrangements at the first town, ensuring that the shipment moved quietly through, without drawing any unwanted attention. Enzo handled similar arrangements in the second town. They met in the evenings to compare notes, to reassure each other that everything remained on schedule, and in those evenings, their old friendship deepened into something that felt, at the time, unbreakable. But somewhere during the 3rd week, something shifted in Enzo that Vincent did not notice until it was too late to prevent what followed. A man from a rival group, operating out of a town further along the coast, had approached Enzo privately, offering him a considerable sum of money in exchange for information about the shipment's exact timing and route. Enzo, burdened at the time by debts of his own, debts related to a sick father and a family struggling to make ends meet, made the decision to accept the offer, believing, perhaps, that he could pass along just enough information to satisfy the rival group without endangering the shipment itself. He was wrong. The information he shared was enough to allow the rival group to intercept a portion of the shipment during its final leg toward the coast, resulting in significant losses for Contadino and the men above him. The interception itself was handled without serious incident, but the financial damage was severe, and more importantly, it revealed a breach of trust that could not be ignored. Contadino's men moved quickly to determine how the rival group had obtained such precise information. The list of people who knew the full details of the shipment was short enough that suspicion narrowed within days. Vincent remembered, even now, the particular quality of dread that settled over him when he first heard whispers that someone within their small circle had spoken out of turn. He had assumed, at first, that the leak had come from someone outside their immediate group, some minor associate who had overheard details he should not have. It took nearly a week before the truth became undeniable, and when it did, it was Vincent himself who first suspected Enzo, though he fought against the suspicion with everything he had, unwilling to believe that his closest friend could have made such a choice. When Contadino finally confirmed what had happened, through channels Vincent never fully understood, he called Vincent to a private meeting, away from the rest of the group. It was in that meeting that Vincent learned the full weight of what was expected of him. Because of his closeness to Enzo, because of the trust the two of them shared, Contadino believed that Vincent was the only person capable of confronting Enzo directly, of ensuring that Enzo understood exactly what his choice had cost, and of extracting from him a clear acknowledgement of the debt he now owed, not simply in money, though money would be part of it, but in loyalty and future service that would bind Enzo to the group for the rest of his life, whether he wished it or not. "You understand," Contadino had told him, "that if he does not accept this arrangement, there are other ways this matter can be resolved. I am offering him, through you, the chance to make things right without further consequence. I am offering this because of your friendship with him, and because I believe, given the chance, he will choose wisely." Vincent had agreed to the task, though every part of him resisted it. He remembered walking to Enzo's family home that evening with a weight in his chest heavier than anything he had carried before, rehearsing words that felt inadequate no matter how he arranged them, knowing that whatever happened in the next hour would change the friendship between them permanently, regardless of how Enzo responded. He found Enzo sitting alone in the small courtyard behind his family's home, staring up at the darkening sky, as though searching for an answer, written somewhere among the emerging stars. Enzo looked up when Vincent approached, and something in his friend's face told Vincent immediately that Enzo already knew why he had come. "You know," Enzo had said quietly, not a question. "I know," Vincent confirmed. They sat together in silence for a long time, before either of them spoke again. Vincent remembered, even now, decades later, how strange it felt to sit beside his closest friend, feeling both deep sympathy for the desperation that had driven Enzo to such a choice, and a clear, unshakable understanding that the choice could not simply be forgiven or forgotten. "My father needed medicine," Enzo finally said. "Medicine we could not afford. I told myself the information I shared would not matter enough to cause real harm. I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong even as I did it, and I did it anyway." Vincent had not judged him for the reason, understanding all too well the particular desperation that came from watching a parent suffer while lacking the means to help. But understanding the reason did not erase the consequence, and it was Vincent's difficult task that evening to make Enzo understand exactly what price now stood between him and any hope of continuing to live safely in Valle Cresta. It was in that courtyard, beneath a darkening sky, that Vincent spoke the word for the first time, the same word he would speak decades later to Enzo's grandson in a closed restaurant on the other side of the world. It was a word passed down through generations in that region, tied to old customs of debt and acknowledgement, a word that, once spoken and accepted, created a binding understanding between the person who spoke it and the person who received it. When Vincent spoke it that evening, he watched something in Enzo's expression shift, a recognition of exactly what was now expected of him, and exactly what would happen if he failed to honor it. Enzo had accepted the terms that evening, terms that would have bound him to Contadino's service, and by extension to further obligations tied to Vincent's own oversight, for years to come. But within a month, rather than honoring the arrangement, Enzo had quietly gathered what remained of his family's savings, along with his ailing father and his younger siblings, and disappeared from Valle Cresta entirely, making his way eventually across the ocean to a new country, where the old debts, he hoped, could not follow him. Vincent remembered the mixture of anger and relief he felt when he learned of Enzo's departure. Anger, because Enzo's flight placed Vincent himself in an uncomfortable position with Contadino, who had trusted Vincent to secure Enzo's compliance. Relief, because some part of Vincent, despite everything, did not wish to see his childhood friend suffer the fuller consequences that might have awaited him had he stayed and failed to honor his word in person. Contadino, when informed of Enzo's flight, had been unexpectedly measured in his response. "Some debts," he told Vincent at the time, "are easier to collect from a distance than they seem. Let him go. The ocean is wide, but it is not infinite, and men rarely escape their own history as completely as they hope to." In the years that followed, Vincent gradually distanced himself from Contadino's circle as well, disturbed by the events surrounding Enzo's betrayal and departure, and increasingly uneasy with a life that demanded such absolute loyalty at such steep personal cost. By the time he was in his late 20s, he had made his own quiet departure from that world, choosing instead to build a modest life for himself, eventually meeting the woman who would become Antonio's mother, and eventually following the same path across the ocean that Enzo had taken years before him, though for entirely different reasons. He had encountered Enzo only once more in this new country, at a chance meeting that neither man had planned or particularly wanted. They had spoken briefly, carefully, each acknowledging the other's presence without fully addressing the history between them. Enzo had asked, with something close to desperation in his voice, that Vincent never reveal what had happened in Vallacresta, fearing what such knowledge might do to the new life he had built for his family in this country. Vincent had agreed, not out of any continued loyalty to Contadino or the old rules of that world, but simply because he had no wish to unravel a peace that both of them had worked hard to build. For over 3 decades, Vincent had kept that promise, saying nothing to anyone, not even to his own son, about the debt Enzo Bardo had once owed and never fully repaid. He had assumed, as the years passed and both men grew old, that the matter would simply fade into irrelevance, a piece of history that would die quietly with the two of them, never troubling the generations that followed. He had not anticipated that Enzo's own grandson would one day sit across a table from Antonio, mocking an old man he assumed carried no history worth respecting, unaware that the very debt his grandfather had fled from decades earlier had never truly been settled, only postponed by an ocean and the passage of time. "That is the story," Vincent said, finishing his account there in the quiet kitchen, the coffee long since gone cold in both their cups. "That is why the word carried the weight it did tonight. It was not simply an old phrase from a language Nicholas barely understands. It was a reminder of a debt his own family has carried, unpaid, for over 30 years. Antonio sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing the full shape of the story his father had just told him, a story that reached back decades before Antonio himself had even been born, tangled with choices made out of desperation and loyalty in a small hillside town neither of them had seen in many years. "What happens now?" Antonio finally asked, "if the Bardo family decides the debt should remain unpaid?" Vincent looked at his son for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim kitchen light. "That," he said quietly, "depends entirely on what kind of man Nicholas's father has raised him to be, and whether the fear his grandfather carried across an ocean was ever truly left behind, or simply passed down, quietly, waiting for a moment exactly like tonight, to surface again." Nicholas Bardo did not sleep that night. He sat instead in the study of his own home, a glass of untouched whiskey on the desk in front of him, replaying the meeting over and over in his mind, searching for some way to make sense of what had happened, some way to convince himself that the old man's words had been nothing more than a clever bluff, an empty threat dressed up in old language meant to unsettle him. But no matter how many times he turned the memory over, he could not shake the certainty that had settled into his chest the moment Vincent Marchetti spoke that single word. Somewhere, deep in a part of his mind he rarely visited, a fragment of memory stirred, something from childhood, a phrase he had heard once, spoken in hushed tones by his own grandfather late at night, long before Nicholas had been old enough to understand its meaning. By morning he could no longer sit alone with the uncertainty. He drove to his father's house on the outskirts of the city, a large property surrounded by tall hedges that had always struck Nicholas as excessive, though he had never questioned it before today. His father, Marco Bardo, had taken over leadership of the family from Enzo many years earlier, after Enzo's health had begun to fail, and Marco had led with a steady, cautious hand ever since. A style of leadership Nicholas had often privately considered too careful, too slow, compared to the boldness he believed the family truly needed. He found his father in the garden behind the house, tending to a row of tomato plants with the same quiet focus Nicholas remembered from childhood. Marco looked up as his son approached, immediately sensing, from the tension in Nicholas's posture, that something had happened. "You look like a man who has not slept," Marco said, setting down his gardening tools. "I need to ask you something," Nicholas said, "about grandfather, about Vallacresta." Marco's expression shifted immediately, the careful stillness that had always characterized him, deepening into something more guarded. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked quietly. "Last night," Nicholas said, "at a meeting with the Marchetti family. Antonio's father was there, an old man. He said a word to me, in Italian, and it was like watching a ghost walk into the room. Everyone froze. He said grandfather owed a debt from Vallacresta, something that was never repaid. Marco was silent for a long moment, staring at his son with an expression Nicholas could not quite read, somewhere between resignation and something that looked almost like relief, as though a burden he had carried alone for many years was finally, however unwillingly, about to be shared. "Sit down," Marco said, gesturing toward a small bench near the garden wall. "This is not a conversation to have standing up." Nicholas sat, and his father joined him a moment later, brushing soil from his hands before folding them in his lap, an unconscious mirror of the same posture Vincent Marchetti had held in his corner of the restaurant the night before, though neither Nicholas nor Marco would ever know that particular detail. "Your grandfather told me part of this story many years ago," Marco began, "before he passed. Not all of it. He was ashamed of much of what happened, and shame, as you may come to learn, often keeps men from telling their children the full truth of their past." Marco explained, as best he understood it, the outline of what had happened decades earlier in Villa Cresta, a story that matched, in its broad strokes, what Vincent had told Antonio the night before, though filtered through Enzo's own guilt and the incomplete memory of a son who had only heard fragments passed down second-hand. He spoke of a debt owed to a group led by a man named Contadino, of a betrayal born from desperation rather than malice, and of a flight across the ocean that Enzo had always described as an escape from consequences that would have followed him for the rest of his life, had he remained. "He always feared," Marco said, "that this debt would find us eventually. He warned me, before he died, that if anyone ever spoke certain words to me, or to you, or to anyone in this family, that it meant the past had finally caught up with us, and that whatever the Marchetti family asked of us in that moment, we would be wise to listen." Nicholas sat with this information for a long time, the morning sun climbing slowly over the hedges surrounding his father's garden, the weight of the previous night's confrontation settling into something more complicated than simple humiliation. He had walked into that meeting believing himself untouchable, certain that his family's strength and his own confidence would carry the day. Instead, he had discovered that his family's history contained a debt older and heavier than anything he had prepared himself to face. "What do we do?" Nicholas finally asked, echoing almost exactly the question Antonio had asked his own father the night before, though neither young man knew that either. Marco considered the question carefully. "We honor it," he said. "Whatever Vincent Marchetti asks of this family, within reason, we provide, until the debt your grandfather left unpaid is finally settled. This is not weakness, Nicholas. This is wisdom. A family that ignores its own history, that pretends old debts simply disappear because enough time has passed, is a family that eventually finds itself facing consequences far worse than a few uncomfortable concessions made now, while there is still a choice in the matter." Nicholas absorbed his father's words slowly, feeling something shift within himself, a recalibration of everything he had assumed about power, about strength, about what it truly meant to lead a family through difficult circumstances. He had spent years believing that boldness alone, unchecked by caution or respect for the past, was the surest path to maintaining control. Now, sitting beside his father in a quiet garden, he began to understand that his father's careful, measured approach carried its own kind of strength, one built not on bravado, but on a clear-eyed respect for consequences that boldness alone could never fully protect against. Later that same day, Nicholas returned to the same restaurant where the meeting had taken place the night before, though this time he came alone, without any of his usual associates, carrying with him not confidence, but something closer to humility, an emotion he had rarely allowed himself to feel until now. He had called ahead, requesting a private conversation with Antonio, and had been surprised, though perhaps he should not have been, when Antonio agreed without hesitation. He found Antonio waiting at a small table near the back of the restaurant, alone as well, no associates standing guard nearby, no tension coiled in the room the way it had been the night before. Vincent was not present this time, and somehow his absence made the room feel lighter, as though the true weight of the previous evening had already been carried and set down, leaving behind only the practical matters that remained to be settled between two younger men trying to find a way forward. "I spoke with my father," Nicholas said, sitting down across from Antonio without any of the swagger that had characterized him the night before. "He confirmed what your father said, about Villa Cresta, about the debt." Antonio nodded slowly, saying nothing, giving Nicholas space to continue. I did not know any of it, Nicholas continued. I grew up hearing fragments, stories half told and quickly changed whenever I asked too many questions. I did not understand, until last night, that those fragments carried real weight, that they were not simply old family legends but something that could reach across decades and change the outcome of a meeting that had nothing, on the surface, to do with any of it. My father kept it hidden too, Antonio said. I only learned the full story last night, sitting in his kitchen until nearly sunrise. 40 years I have known him, and I never once suspected the history he was carrying. The two men sat in silence for a moment, each considering how strange it was that a single evening had unraveled decades of carefully guarded family history on both sides, revealing connections neither of them had known existed, until circumstances forced them into the light. The shipment will be delivered today, in full, Nicholas said, as I promised. But I want to offer something more than that, if your father is willing to accept it. My father suggested that whatever debt remains from Vallecresta, we should finally settle it properly, in whatever way your family believes is fair, rather than letting it linger unresolved for another generation. Antonio considered this for a long moment. I will speak with my father, he said, but I believe he would say the same thing he told me last night. He does not wish for old debts to define the future relationship between our families. What matters more to him, I think, is that this history is finally acknowledged honestly, rather than buried again, waiting to surface at some future moment neither of us can predict. Then perhaps, Nicholas said, the two of us can build something different than what our fathers and grandfathers built, something not shaped entirely by old debts and old fears, but by an honest understanding of where we both came from, and a clearer sense of where we might go from here. Antonio studied Nicholas for a long moment, searching his face for any trace of the arrogance that had colored his behavior the night before, and finding instead something more thoughtful, more measured, the look of a young man who had been genuinely humbled by circumstances beyond his control, and who seemed, at least for now, willing to learn from the experience rather than resent it. That would be good, Antonio said finally, for both our families. They spoke for a while longer, working through practical matters, adjusting terms that had been contentious the night before, into arrangements both men could accept, without either side feeling as though they had surrendered something essential. By the time Nicholas left the restaurant that afternoon, the tension that had defined their previous meeting had been replaced by something far more stable, an understanding, built not on intimidation or fear, but on a shared recognition of history, consequence, and the value of choosing wisdom over pride when circumstances allowed for such a choice. That evening, Antonio drove once more to his father's house, finding Vincent in the small garden out front, tending to a row of flowers with the same careful attention he brought to everything he did. Vincent looked up as his son approached, reading something in Antonio's expression before a single word had been spoken between them. It went well, Vincent said, more statement than question. Better than well, Antonio said, settling onto the low stone wall beside the garden. Nicholas came to see me today. His father confirmed everything you told me. They intend to honor whatever you believe is fair, to finally settle what was left unresolved. Vincent nodded slowly, a quiet satisfaction settling over his weathered features. Sometimes, he said, the heaviest debts are not settled through consequence, but through honesty. I did not know, when I stood up in that room last night, exactly how the evening would end. I only knew that silence, in that moment, was no longer the right choice. Antonio watched his father continue working among the flowers, and found himself thinking, not for the first time that day, about how much he had learned in the span of only 24 hours, not simply about his father's hidden history, but about the nature of respect itself, about how it could not be demanded through volume or aggression, but was instead built slowly, through years of quiet integrity, through choices made carefully and consistently until, when the moment finally called for it, a single word, spoken plainly and without hesitation, carried more weight than any threat ever could. I used to think, Antonio said quietly, that strength meant never showing weakness, never allowing anyone to see uncertainty or hesitation. I am beginning to understand that real strength is something else entirely. It is the quiet confidence of a man who has already faced his hardest moments, long before anyone around him ever noticed. Vincent looked up from the flowers, meeting his son's eyes with an expression of quiet warmth he rarely allowed himself to show so openly. "You are learning," he said simply. "That is all any father can truly hope for." They remained there together, as the evening light faded slowly over the small garden, father and son, finally understanding each other in a way that decades of shared history had never quite allowed, until circumstances, unplanned and unwelcome as they had first appeared, brought them fully into the light. And somewhere across the city, in a study surrounded by tall hedges, a young man named Nicholas Bardo sat with his own father, finally beginning to understand that the debts of the past, however old, however quiet, were never truly gone, only waiting patiently for the right moment to be acknowledged, and that acknowledging them, rather than fearing them, was often the surest path toward building something stronger and more lasting than either family had managed to build before.